Hey friends, welcome to Straw Dogs. Yes, it's called Straw Dogs, not Grass Dogs. This time around, we're going to start reading Dao De Jing Chapter 2, because we already went through many of the important ideas in Chapter 1. So we're going to start with the first passage from Chapter 2. Now let me get my ugly mug out of the way here. That's sufficient. Maybe I'll get rid of my face completely. Now you will only hear a disembodied voice. So, I've decided to take a different approach this time. We don't need as much etymological information about these terms because they are not as important to the theory of the Dao De Jing in their, let's say, individual character sense. This idea actually is more of an idea that's formed by the combination of words rather than having special emphasis on individual words like xuan, mystery, or Dao, the way. You get the idea. If you've watched the earlier videos, then you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't, go back and watch them. I go into a lot of detail about characters that are important in Chapter 1 of the Dao De Jing, as well as broadly important in Taoism in general. Okay, so Chapter 2. Now you get to hear me struggle again with the tonal pronunciation. I'll do my best. So, 天下皆知美智为美. Okay, so 天下 means the world. So, in a sense, it means like the entirety of pre-dynastic China as the world, in a sense, right? It's like all of those places under the sky, right? So Tian means sky, Xia means under. You remember we talked about Tiandi in the first chapter, right? Heaven and earth. So in this case, Tian Xia, everything under heaven. So all of the world under heaven, all of the atmosphere, all of the living beings, etc., right? That's Tian Xia. And then Jie means all of them, everyone. So Tian Xia Jie, everyone in the world is what it's saying. Zhi means to know, to be knowledgeable about. So 天下皆知 means everyone in the world knows. 美 means beauty. 美 beautiful. 知 it connects me to the next word. It's kind of like of or apostrophe s. 为 means to act upon something or to be something or to become something. 美 again means beautiful. So 天下皆知美智为美. Everyone in the world knows that beauty is the reason for beauty, or everybody knows that beauty is beautiful. So the translation that I've gone with here is pretty similar to the old Legged translation, which is one of the earlier Dao De Jing translations. I broadly agree with it. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of different ways you could go with it, right? Because you have to ask the question about does Wei Mei have a specific meaning, right? So Wei Mei could mean like it is beautiful. Wei could mean that it is or it acts as, and Mei definitely means beautiful. But Wei Mei could also mean like it does the act of beauty, right? But I think that parsing it that tightly is difficult, at least for my level of Chinese language knowledge. I'm not quite at the level where I can tell you definitively what that means. That's more than I can do. So let's say that we can get a general translation. 天下皆知美智为美. Right? So everyone in the world knows that beauty is the reason for beauty. Everybody in the world knows that the beauty of the beautiful, right? They understand that beauty is what we're looking for when we go to appreciate beauty, if that makes sense. Then the next part, it says 斯俄以. So this is ugly already, is one way to think about it. 斯 means this. 斯 is the same as the modern use of 这, right? If anybody here speaks Mandarin, 这个, right? 这个 is how you say this, right? 我要这个, 我要这个, I want this thing. 这 and 这, it's just two different pronunciations. But basically, 斯 is another way to say this. Means ugly, repulsive, vile, not good. Now, I've heard the Dao De Jing pronounced as si yi. This is one way to pronounce Another way is yu. It also means ugly, but I don't think it's pronounced that way. I've heard that in some Chinese medicine texts it is, and yu may be an older pronunciation of but again, my level of sinological knowledge is not quite there. So let's get a working definition. 四而已. So, 四 this, bad, ugly, not good. 已 can mean already, but it can also mean, let's see, how did I do it there? Like present, right? It's already present, right? So the idea then, when you put all of those characters together that we just reviewed, right? 天下皆知美之谓美斯恶已, right? It means everybody in the world knows that beauty, essentially we can say beauty is prized for its beauty. That already implies that ugliness is present. So you could say this is already ugly. But a few years ago, I might have translated it like that. But I think it means that implies that ugliness is already present in people's minds. Because if they know to look for something which is beautiful, then it's pretty likely that they're making a comparison against the beauty, which is desirable to them, and the ugly, which is not desirable to them. And so in this context, I think it's pretty okay to say that everybody in the world knows that beauty is prized for its beauty, but this means that ugliness is already present in their minds. And at least in my reading of the Dao De Jing, by the way, which is a meditation-based reading of the Dao De Jing, I think that what the author is really trying to say is that in order to understand the differentiation of things like beauty, then you already have to have the differentiation of ugliness in your mind. Another way to say it is, in order to have something which is favorable and desirable, then you must have some innate understanding of that which is not favorable and not desirable. And so that means that the favorable and desirable actually generates the unfavorable. Now, you might not know this, but also means to be averse to something. Now, doesn't this start to sound a little bit like Buddhism, right? You have the, let's say, the desirable and that which makes you averse. And then, of course, in Buddhism, you also have the something which isn't desirable and doesn't cause aversion, right? If you look at the Pali Canon, for instance. But this is a pretty similar idea. So there are things in life which are desirable. There are things in life which cause aversion or disgust or make you unhappy. But those things are always contained. There's no way around it as long as you have a judgmental mind. And we'll get back to that later. You're not going to do away with your judgmental mind completely, probably. But you may be able to reduce it, and you may be able to perceive things in a different way that doesn't require you to value them as beautiful or to view them as reprehensible and ugly, right? So that's the first line. The second line, 戒之善之谓善. So everybody knows. Now, 善, this word, it can mean benevolent, it can mean good, and it can mean skillful. 善 has a bunch of different meanings, but I like to think that it means skillful in this context. And even in modern Chinese, if you go to some some places which are not like the biggest cities. Like you go to not the countryside necessarily, but you go to, smaller places like third tier cities, so called, right? You hear people saying, "Oh, 他闪什么东西, that person is skillful at whatever they like it, they like to do it, right? Let me see. 他闪练功夫, that person is skillful in practicing martial arts. You can see that actually quite often. Is an older, if as far as I understand, it's an older dialect. I've run across it in Henan and Shandong province specifically. So I'm going to go with skillful here. So 戒之善之谓善思不善矣. So everybody knows the skillful, or that skill is the domain of the skillful, right? It's the activity of the skillful. So again, we have to try to find out, does wei mean that something is an action, right? Because in the first line, you remember I said, I'm not really sure if mei zhi wei mei, if wei is an implied action or whether it means it is. So again, does it mean that the skillful is skillful, or does it mean that the skillful act with skill? I don't think it matters too much. With the Dao De Jing, if you get the basic correct translation, you could have multiple different translations that are not in conflict with each other. And so you don't have to worry too much about whether you get it exactly perfect. Getting it exactly perfect might kind of be beside the point of the text anyway. So then, 四不善矣, right? So then this is not skillful already. This implies not skillful, right? So everyone in the world understands that skill is the domain of the skillful. That already implies that there's a lack of skill. Now, here's another question for you. Should you read this passage as an admonition? What I mean is, if you say, 天下皆知美之谓美色而已, so everyone in the world knows that beauty is prized for its beauty, this is already ugly. That's an admonition. 戒之善之谓善四不善矣, right? So everyone knows that skill is the domain of the skillful. This is already not skillful. So that's how a lot of people read this passage. That's an okay reading of the passage. It's an admonition. It's telling you this is something that people do that's not the optimal condition for living, right? Because if you prize beauty for its beauty, then you already generate in your mind a sense of ugliness. And so this admonition, it relies on the first chapter of the Dao De Jing, which informs us that if you always have desire, then you'll only ever get to the border. You'll never get into the Dao, right? So if you take it like that, then this can be an admonition to say, if you strive for beauty, you create ugliness. Now, is that always universally true, right? Again, our Buddhist friends might say, well, if you always chase after worldly things, then you get stuck in the world. And if you get stuck in the world, then you get drawn back into desire. And if you get drawn back into desire, then ultimately you suffer. And that's a reasonable interpretation. I'm not against that interpretation at all. So then, if you were going to take that interpretation, then 戒之善之谓善四不善矣, right? Then everybody knows that skill is the domain of the skillful. This is already not skillful. Then that's an admonition too. What that's saying is, when you strive to be skillful, or you strive to find skillful people, and you'll see in chapter 3 that is implied. If you strive to have skill or to find skillful people, then actually that results in a lot of problems, because it results in an argument about who's more skillful. Now, I mean, clearly, the people who designed the Dao De Jing hadn't come across the idea of open and fair competition as a way to improve society, right? They weren't thinking like that at that time. That's a kind of newer idea, maybe like 18th or 19th century idea, and really emphasized in the 20th century and 21st century. But anyway, it could be that kind of admonition. It could be saying, hey, look, you think that beauty should be strived for because you like it, because you desire it. That already creates ugliness in your heart. Oh, you think that skill is something that you should look for in people or that you should try to cultivate in yourself. Actually, that just shows that you don't have any skill. Why don't you have any skill? Because in the process of trying to get the benefit from having skill, you create problems with other people because of competition. Whereas if you weren't in competition with them, then they'd never even notice that you're a potential threat to them, and then everybody would enjoy a beautiful life together. And that's, it's one way that people look at this text. So that's one interpretation. But let's look at another interpretation, which is just a statement of fact. By the way, both of these interpretations can exist mutually. They can coexist together. No problem at all. But as a statement of fact, it reads, everyone in the world knows that beauty is prized for its beauty. That implies that they also know about ugliness. Everybody in the world knows that skill is the domain of the skillful. That implies that they also know that there's such a thing as not being skillful. And so if you read the rest of chapter 2, which we'll be doing in the coming weeks, you'll actually see that this second version, which is not an admonition, fits a little bit better with the context of chapter 2. Because what chapter 2 actually does is it starts to set down the narrative or the principle that everything has an opposite in nature. And those opposite things always have a habit of following each other around. So they follow each other around and they create the condition that the other one can exist in. Beauty creates the precondition for ugliness because you're comparing them, right? Skill creates the precondition for clumsiness because you're comparing them. Up, down, left, right, short, tall, whatever. I'm short, by the way. I'm only 5'7". So yeah, anyway, but I'll get over that because I won't compare myself against tall people that often. Anyway, all jokes aside, I think that the second interpretation is nicer. Anyway, it's more in keeping with the rest of the chapter. And the other thing is, it doesn't set up bivalent ontology, to quote good old Jacques Derrida. When Derrida talked about bivalent ontology, so it was in his first book. Hey, what are we doing here talking about postmodernism? Anyway, Derrida's first book, which is called, I think it's called On Grammatology. It's a kind of media studies book. And what he says is that people in the Western world have a habit of establishing bivalent ontologies. And what he means by that is that there's a bivalence and things are split into two poles. And you use that to understand the world. So you have good and evil, for instance, as the greatest bivalent ontology of, let's say Western religion. And so when you establish those things, then you create a difficulty for new ideas to arise, because there can't be ideas that don't live somewhere on the pole of those things. Now, of course, that, I don't really agree with Derrida, because there's always been plenty of things that aren't split into opposites, right? There's plenty of places in life where you don't engage in only, so-called black and white. But anyway, that he says that Western culture especially works in that way. Now, I would argue that every culture works in that way, basically, because people have to delineate what they're allowed to do in society and what they're not allowed to do in society, right? You have to have some definition of what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And beyond that, there's also aesthetics, right? And so, the idea that black and white are opposites of each other It just delineates that there's a presence of light and a presence of darkness, and those things have practical values and aesthetic values, right? If you live in a place with lots of wild animals, then you probably don't go out at night without a torch, right? This is, maybe I'm going too far with this, but basically, the Dao De Jing has a different argument, though. The argument in the Dao De Jing is that you don't want to use those judgments to make every decision in the world, right? Because the Dao De Jing is written with leaders of a country in mind. So what they're saying to the leaders is, listen, you have this country and it has an economy and it has people and it has agriculture and it has soldiers, and you've got to hold it all together. But when you do that, you need to make sure that you do it in a way that's good for all of the people. It's not only good for you, and you have to make sure that you stop the people from wanting to rebel against you and killing you, right? That's approximately the message of the political part of the Dao De Jing. So the way that they think that you should do that is by ruling very quietly and being circumspect and making sure you see what's going on before you act on it, right? Observe before you act. And don't act based on prejudice, act based on the reality of the situation. So in that sense, if you say, well, knowing beauty, prizing beauty, it means there will certainly be ugliness. Actually, it falls into the same logical trap as that very statement, right? The structure is the same. If you say, well, something will certainly come out badly for you, then actually you've already fallen into exactly the same trap of naming the outcome before it's clear that it will happen. Hey, you know what? If you give me a mango, it's a really good mango, it smells wonderful, it's sweet, I love it, it's delightful, and I eat it, and nothing bad happens to me, and I fully enjoyed the experience, and it was meaningful and beautiful and excellent, then that doesn't necessarily mean that my appreciation of the beauty of the mango will be a bad thing, and I might just enjoy it because it's beautiful, right? So if you make a statement which is an admonition using this text, then you might have already fallen into the logical error that it's pointing out, right? The logical error that it's pointing out is that when you make distinctive judgments about things, then they have a tendency of eliciting a problem. They have a tendency of eliciting the opposite of the judgment, right? Ugliness could turn into beauty too. And so Zhuangzi has great examples of that, right? So we need to understand that these might just be statements of fact, right? If you know that there's beauty, then you also know that there's ugliness. Now, Chen Yingning, who was, let's say, the founder of secular spiritual Taoism, he said that all of these ideas go back to the Tao, because the Tao is the forerunner of the universe. It generates the universe. Ergo, before the universe is created, there's no observer. The Tao generates a singularity. That singularity, which is nature, generates the potential for life. And the potential for life generates life. Life is conscious. Therefore, or at least some of life is conscious. Therefore, you need to have life before you can start comparing things. So at the time of the Tao, there's nothing to compare the Tao to. At the time the Tao creates nature, there's nothing to compare nature or the Tao to. At the time that nature creates life, there's still nothing to compare them to. It's only after we have a conscious, sentient being that we can begin to make those comparisons. And so if we want to get the benefit of the Tao, if we want to get the advantage of the Tao, then actually we have to return back to a non-judgmental state, and a state that doesn't define things, and a state that isn't worried about beauty or ugliness or skill or clumsiness, right? None of those things matter in the state of the Tao. And that's what creates all things. That's what creates us. That's the most pure energy in the universe. Therefore, when we practice the Tao, the purpose is to go to that state. Now, I'm going to bring you into this secret, so to speak. The reason why people practice Daoist meditation in this way, to enter into a neutral state, which is non-judgmental, which has no mind, which has no awareness of body, right, which goes back to the root origin of existence, which is non-existence, is actually because for some reason that state generates a more complete sense of being. It generates awareness, it generates clarity, and it generates a sense of internal energy which can heal the body in some ways. So this use of a neutral state that doesn't engage in differentiation and judgment in Daoist meditation practice is actually done on purpose to create a physiological and psychological response. And it happens to be the case that the people who created internal alchemy, or sitting and forgetting, they discovered this principle through experimentation over a long time. And the principle aligns with the concepts of Taoism. Therefore, internal alchemy started out as a Daoist system of meditation rather than a Buddhist system or a Confucian system, right? And it had more success in Taoism because it uses the concept of the Tao in order to establish the rules of its practice. But does that mean that you literally go back to the Tao every time you practice? It depends on how you define Tao. You could say, yeah, sure. But you might also say, well, Tao is used here as a metaphor or a meaning or something like that, which shows the intangible nature of reality. And when we meditate, we get this certain physiological and psychological response that in some way shows us that nature, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that you go back to the Tao, because remember, there is no the Tao, right? The Tao is intangible. It's suspended in non-being. You can't see it. There's no observer. So, but it does generate reality. And in the long run, it generates your life and your energy and your consciousness. So that's the secret, actually, of internal alchemy. If you understand that, then you can go more deeply into the practice, and it becomes increasingly more rewarding. And so this passage from chapter 2 of the Dao De Jing, right? 天下皆知而美之为美，斯有意义；皆知善之为善，斯不善矣。What I think it's really saying is, whenever your post-heaven mind is caught up in thought, it's always defining things relative to their opposite. It's always defining things relative to a comparison. And that comparison is not useful in terms of nurturing your energy and causing you to become more aware. It could be very useful in terms of, going to work every day and getting your job done. But in terms of cultivating the Tao or cultivating reality or cultivating enlightenment, it's not so useful. And so at least when you meditate, and if not at other times, put down the definitions, put down the opposites. Don't get too caught up in beauty. Don't get too caught up in ugliness. Don't get too stuck on whether you're skillful or not. Enjoy your time peacefully and happily, and things will work out better for you in the long run.